Okay, so we're talking about the Texas Revolution. This is where the yellow is where Texas was, and the green was Mexico. It all started off because the Mexican Spanish rancheros wanted to sell and trade their beef to the Americans. And this was a super profitable deal. So they were super excited. And so this guy named Pike was super also impressed with it. He wrote of the fertility of the soil, the luxurious of the grasslands, and the general awesomeness about the Tejones, which are the native-born Mexicans. In Pike's conversations with the leading men, he found them interested in three topics: money, horses, and other people, and ascending order of parents. They spoke earnestly to him about their interest in opening trade with the United States. Most were rancheros who raised longhorn cattle and were always ready to be cattle ranchers. Cattle ranching, introduced by Mexico by the first Spanish colonists, provided the foundation of the Texas economy, and Tejones leaders had hopes of supplying the market for beef in places like New Orleans. Pike had agreed that Tejones was most agreeable. A few years after Pike's departure, the Texas he admired lay in ruins. Then the turmoil of Mexico's independence against Spain in the 1810s, the province became a target for American adventurers known as filibusters. A filibuster army took San Antonio by storm and then was routed by a royalist army. In 1819, an expedition of American mercenaries took over the East Texas town. Unless the province was strengthened, Spanish authorities knew it was only a matter of time before it would fall victim to American aggression. Unable to attract migration from central Mexico, they proved receptive to an idea proposed by entrepreneur Moses Austin, who had proposed as the owner of lead mines in Missouri, had prospered. After a visit to Texas in 1820, Austin made application for a large grant of land on which he would settle 300 American families. Clearly inviting Americans in was taking a risk, but Austin promised to settle a different kind of American. And the Spanish reasoned that unless the province was developed, it would inevitably fall to the United States. In 1821, they approved Austin's plan, granting him 200,000 acres of rich Texas soil. His land stretched along the rich bottoms of the Colorado and Brazos rivers, rolling gently down to the Gulf Coast. These were among the richest alluvial lands in all of the West. Settlers were given the choice of claiming 177 acres of farmland, or 4,428 acres for grazing. The herds of cattle that fattened on these ranches and the cotton that flourished in these soils were soon major exports, all of which went to the United States. The Mexican government made 3 more grants to Austin, allowing him to colonize an additional 900 American families. He was one of a number of impresarios, land speculators given the authority to settle families in exchange for awards of thousands of acres to themselves. Many Americans, so these are the rancheros. Many Americans simply drifted into Texas and squatted on the best land they could find. Unpredictable as the flooded delta channels of the Mississippi, and as irksome as bars and snags, these squatters were the frontier types that Austin carefully excluded from his own invitations. By 1823, the 1,500 settlers in Austin's colony had been supplemented by at least 300,000 squatters in the East Texas region bordering Louisiana. The Texians, as the Americans called themselves, were rapidly outnumbering the Tejones, concentrated in the southern half of the province. One of the fundamental principles of the Mexican independence movement was the abolition of slavery and the equality of all citizens regardless of color. Attracted by these ideals, a small number of free African Americans immigrated from the United States to Texas during the 1820s. Samuel H. Hardin and his wife came, he wrote, because Mexico's laws invited their immigration. In Virginia, John Bird moved because he believed he and his sons would be received as citizens and entitled to land. Several free African American heads of households were granted land by the Mexican government, and there were at least 2 other African American settlers in the Austin colony. But the number of free African Americans was insignificant compared to the thousands of slaves who came with the Euro American settlers. Slavery was a founding institution of the region that the early 19th century Euro Americans called the Southwest, the states of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and the territory of Arkansas. African American labor cleared the pine forests and drained the swamps, opening plantations and making cotton production the engine of the region's economy. Most slaves arrived with their masters, but most were brought in by traders. "We require more slaves," settler William Dunbar wrote from the Mississippi frontier in 1799. "Ordinary men are worth $500 cash, women $400 and upwards. There is no country where they are better treated." What nonsense! Planters on this frontier were infamous for driving their slaves beyond the point of endurance, and slaves in the upper South trembled at the thought of being quote, "sold down the river," a threat frequently employed by masters to keep their hands in line. Slavery lent its full measure to the violent character of frontier life. Samuel Towns was one of the many Southwestern masters who drove his slaves hard. Impatient that his African American women were picking less than half the cotton of the men, he insisted his overseer make those people go at least 100 pounds a day or whip them like the devil, quote quotes. The lashings, he later noted with satisfaction, had measurably improved their productivity. Visitors were horrified by the dueling, fist-fighting, and brutal practical joking. So here's a picture of the horrible enslavement of African Americans picking cotton. And like I said, it was brutal beatings and driving enslaved people to do the hardest work for incredibly long hours. So Mexico was extremely concerned, and people were in an attempt to protect their border province of Texas. In 1830, the Mexican Congress passed a colonization law, canceling all pending contracts, banning further immigration from the United States, and authorizing the occupation of the province by the Mexican army. It was one thing to send troops, raising panic and fear among Texians, but quite another to close the border to Americans determined to cross it. By the 1830s, the Southwest was experiencing an epidemic of Texas fever. Over the next 5 years, the Texian population rose from 7,000 to nearly 30,000, and by 1835, Tejanos were outnumbered 7-1 by the Euro-Americans. Texians were divided into 2 political factions. Austin's group, known as the Peace Party, argued for Texas continuing in the Mexican Union with more autonomy, the complete legalization of slavery, and the elimination of all barriers to free trade with the United States. Leading Tejanos shared many of these sentiments. Indeed, marriage frequently settled the alliance of Texians and Tejanos. Austin's moderates were opposed by the Texian War Party, which demanded the secession of Texas from Mexican Federation and its annexation by the United States. William Barrett Travis, a volatile and ambitious young lawyer, became the rallying point for this group. Like many other settlers, Travis had come to Texas to escape creditors in a failed marriage, leaving his wife behind to nurse his infant son and fend off the bill collectors. Austin, however, fell under the growing Mexican suspicion of all Americans was thrown into jail and kept for 18 months in a small windowless cell. When he was finally released, he was a convert to independence. But Austin's day had passed. A more volatile breed of Texian was now in saddle. There was Davy Crockett, who had recently lost his Congress seat. And there was Sam Houston, a giant of man whose girth was matched by his enormous character. Houston and Crockett hoped to make a new start on this frontier. They arrived just in time for a revolution. The attack on the garrison at Galveston Bay and convinced conservatives in Mexico City that the Texians were in revolt. Rebellion against central authority was simmering in other provinces as well. In October, Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna issued a warning abolishing all state governments and placing the central government directly in charge of local affairs, essentially transforming himself into a dictator. With an army of 4,000, Santa Anna marched north, crushing all opponents in his path. In Texas, there was a panic. The Mexican army was advancing. The Texians took up arms, joined by a number of leading Tejones. They besieged San Antonio at the cost of much destruction, forced the withdrawal of the Mexican troops stationed there. Considering San Antonio and the southern half of the province indefensible because of the Tejano majority, he ordered his troops northward, leaving only a small detachment under the command of William Travis to hold San Antonio. At the approach of Santa Anna's army, most Tejones fled the city, and the Texians, including James Bowie and Davy Crockett, fortified themselves in the ancient mission ruin of the Alamo. Probably thinking to terrorize the Texians, Santa Anna decided he would destroy the Alamo and his defenders. His siege ended in a 5-hour assault on March 6, 1836. That cost the lives of some 600 Mexican soldiers and 187 Texians. Santa Anna had their bodies burned so there would be no memorial. Yet, the slogan, "Remember the Alamo," became the emotional point that helped keep doubters in the camp of independence and potential deserters in the army. So here's the destruction at the Alamo. Santa Anna moved on to the town of Goliad, where he captured and executed 371 Anglo prisoners, and then pushed north as the Texian army fell back in panic. But then the Mexican general made a disastrous error, dividing his army to terrorize the people by burning and plundering the country. Seizing the opportunity, Houston and 900 Texians surprised Santa Anna and a small force of 1,200 at the San Jacinto River on April 21st. Taking their revenge for the Alamo and Goliad, the Texians slaughtered more than 600 of the disorganized Mexicans. Santa Anna was captured and, under duress, signed a treaty granting Texas independence. There's San Jacinto. The United States recognized the independent Republic of Texas on March 3, 1837. The new Texas Constitution legalized slavery and barred the residence of all free persons of color. So this was also a time when the bitterness towards the Tejones were remained, and most Tejones Mexican communities were expelled, and those who were free. So slavery was legalized, and then also free African Americans. And it just made the issue of slavery even worse and headed us closer to the Civil War. So these are the two slides that you need to take notes on. Texas is independent. And then so the result of how it helped, how it hurt the Mexicans, and then how it hurt also the African Americans, and then its impact on the Euro Americans would become part of the United States soon afterwards. And so it was a great benefit for those who owned slaves, who could then enslave their people without anybody saying anything about it, and they could be part of the United States, which they liked. And that's the end.